Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for showing up. I have to start with kind of an apology to the people that I've been working with of late. My little cluster of Zen Zoom buddies, because I'm going to cover something today that we've been talking about, but I haven't really brought it up to a larger audience before, and I'd like to run it by people and in the hope that it'll be helpful. So primarily, Zen is known as the sudden school of awakening. Doesn't put a lot of truck on intellection, reading, study. Basically, it's the deep water of Zazen, which softens our mind. Yesterday we read a piece by a great Tibetan master called Dilgo Khyentse, who was one of the teachers of the Dalai Lama. And he made the analogy that when we believe our thoughts, when we trust that they have actual solidity, we're hardening our mind to become like ice. And the practice of meditation softens our mind to return to water. It's the same mind, but it's in different forms. So because of this emphasis on sudden awakening, unless you're a kind of inveterate reader and faux intellectual like I am, who reads a lot of books, you don't have to read too much. But about 6 months ago, a very old friend of mine, early Zen student of Suzuki Roshi's, sent me a book that I want to bring to everybody's attention. And my Zen Zoom buddies and I have been discussing it and talking about it at length. This is the book. It's called The Feeling Buddha by David Brazier. The Feeling Buddha. And I want to talk about it for a couple of reasons. Even though I've been a Zen student for almost 50 years, and have passed over a number of the hurdles of that practice where you get permission to do different things, including teach independently. There have been problems that I've had with Zen practice all those years. Maybe not the first two when I was just racing to catch up. But what were some of those problems? It seemed to me that a number of Zen communities were a little chilly, little cold, not so warm about welcoming people. Not like the Tibetans, for instance, who've been kind of running away with Buddhist practice on this continent because they're so incredibly much fun and they're such loving and warm people, you can't help but be attracted to them. You can go to many Zen students and you're greeted by a stoic figure who looks you in the eye and says, "May I help you?" It's kind of like an appointment with the proctologist. So that was one problem that I had because I'm an emotional person and I'm not afraid of my emotions. The other problem was there was a kind of deep expectation that if we could just get enlightened, we would wind up on the other side of a fence, breaking through the veil that separates this world of samsara from nirvana. And we would be in cotton candy and whipped cream land. And all of our problems would disappear. And not only was that not the case in my own experience or the experience of other people I knew who'd had wake up or enlightenment experiences, it produced a kind of negative effect. And the negative effect was that people appeared to be ashamed of having problems. As if I reveal a problem to you, I'm a 50-year Zen student, and I reveal a problem, I'm admitting that I'm spiritually challenged. I haven't really mastered the Buddha's practices and, ended all suffering. And this is a serious issue because it closes off intimacy. It makes us unsure about who we can talk to and what we want to reveal to ourselves, because we all want to be enlightened. We all want to be helpful. We all want to be happy. But, this life is what it is. So when I encountered this book went back to the Buddha's actual words. What did the Buddha actually say? And I got interested in his analysis, and the more I've gotten into it and the deeper I've gotten into this book, the more moved I am by it, and the more I'm attracted to its helpfulness. It's helpful. It addresses these problems of being afraid of feeling, of assuming that enlightenment will deliver us to a kind of life unknown to mortals. So let's start. When the Buddha was enlightened, he paced around, he fretted, he fressed for 49 days, thinking that what he had discovered was too subtle for ordinary people. They wouldn't get it. And he just didn't know what to do. And finally, I haven't spoken to him myself, but having had something of the same experiences, I realized he probably thought I could help someone. And the compassionate nature that he had led him to try. So he went back to the 6 disciples with whom he'd been practicing. And these guys had been frosty with him because they had been practicing asceticism for 6 years. And the Buddha practiced it so diligently that he passed out in a ditch. Just a sack of skin and bones. And a little peasant girl was walking by with a jug of milk and rice, which she was taking to a temple to offer a sacrifice. And she saw the Buddha, and she spontaneously dropped into the ditch and fed him. And there was something about this spontaneous act, breaking all laws, taking the temple food, giving it to this starving mendicant, that appeared to really energize the Buddha as much as the food that he was given. And when he commenced his sitting that led to his insight, he made a decision that extremes on either end, extremes of indulgence in passion and extremes of asceticism, were undignified and not helpful and created more problems. And he dedicated himself to this middle path, this sitting upright, prajna paramita, the highest form of meditation, what we call zazen. So when he came down the road, it was immediately apparent to all these guys that he had changed. I mean, they'd been living in the jungle, fleas, ticks, lice, snakes, begging every day. And suddenly this guy came back and he was indisputably different. So different that when he told his story, one of the 6, named Kandana, was immediately enlightened. And I think the reason that story stays in the historical record and is important is because it demonstrates that if you're ready, a turning word can set you loose. You don't have to study arcane literature and learn Pali and Sanskrit and do all that stuff. There's nothing wrong with it if that's your predilection, but it's not necessary. And neither is it necessary to become a convert of the Buddhas. Kandana went bingo and went off and lived his life. So here's what the Buddha said to the others. He gave them the 4 noble truths. And whenever we read the noble truths, I've always had a problem with it, because the first noble truth is that suffering exists. And yeah, it does. Anyone who reads the paper, anyone who reads watches TV news, it's indisputable that there's a lot of suffering in the world. But is that the general human condition? I mean, when I'm at my desk, when I'm working, when I'm gardening, when I'm doing something, am I suffering? That was not my experience. So I always had trouble with that. So did David Brazier, the author of this book. And he went back to the original Sanskrit, and he went back to the original Pali, the two languages that Pali was a kind of religious language. It wasn't spoken, but it was the language of spirituality that many of Buddha's speeches were translated into. And the first thing he found out is that Buddha didn't use the word suffering. Buddha didn't speak English. Buddha used the word dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A. And rather than have you guess what it meant, he told you what it meant. This is what it means. The noble truth of dukkha. And he called it, and this is Brazier's choice of a word, affliction. He calls it affliction because it's stuff that happens to us. It's stuff we're blameless for. It just happens. It's like stirring the pot of life. Sometimes good lumps come up, sometimes bad lumps come up. But this is what Buddha said dukkha was. Birth, old age, sickness, death, grief, lamentation, pain, depression, and agitation. Dukkha means being associated with what you do not like, being separated from what you do like, and not being able to get what you want. That's dukkha. So this led Brazier to consider, wait a minute, if Buddha was enlightened and Buddha died and dukkha is dying, well, how can you say that after enlightenment dukkha stops? Well, Buddha never said that. So dukkha is affliction. And he calls it a noble truth. Truth is pretty simple. Truth means real, indisputable, real. Noble, Buddha was a prince. All the people who were around knew what princes were, knew what royalty was. Noble means dignified, worthy of respect, worthy of dignity. So this thing that afflicts all people, Buddha elevates to nobility, to a noble truth. Why does he do that? He does it, first of all, to stop you from being ashamed. He does it, second of all, to alert you that it's actually going to be helpful to you, that there's a way to deal with it. He's getting there. But first, he's identifying the culprit. He's identifying the stiff wind that we all face, the stiff wind that we usually run away from. So dukkha is the first noble truth. The second noble truth is called samudaya, and it means arising. And when we're afflicted with something, someone slaps us, something arises. If we stub our toes, something arises. If we bump the open cupboard door, something arises. If people speak badly to us, something arises. So far, there's no responsibility for those first two things. Affliction happens. It's the stiff wind we all face into every moment we're alive. And arising is what comes up within us. We don't have to be ashamed of it. It's a noble truth. It's the immediate energetic reaction to what afflicts us. We sit too close to the fire, ouch, we move away. It moves us. We see something we like, we move toward it. It's what keeps human beings rattling around the gerbil wheel. Now, the third noble truth is the one where we can intervene. The third noble truth is called nirodha. Nirodha. And the image that the Buddha used would have been an image that would have been familiar to any peasant, anyone in India. Nepal is where Buddha lived. The word means containment. And the image was a clay wall that's banked up around a fire pit to keep the fire contained, to stop sparks from flying off onto the rush roofs of the houses and burning up the village. In this day and age, we know that if we throw some gasoline on the ground and light it, other than starting a forest fire, it just burns and dissipates its heat. If we put it into the closed container of an outboard motor or a car, it does work for us. So this containment is the place where we can intervene. This is the place where no matter what arises, we can interdict it and we can keep it. And one of the reasons we can keep it is because we sit zazen and meditate. Because the more familiar we become with softening the mind, with watching thoughts arise and watching them disappear like vapors, the more our bodies learn that these are not real tangible events as they feel in dreams. That emptiness, the kind of pregnant energy of the universe, which is always transforming itself into forms. It's the only way we can see it. But we can sense it inside our own body-mind construct. The more we sit, the quieter we get, the longer pauses between thoughts that we can examine, and that kind of colorless screen in there on which our thoughts are protected is sort of our doorway into the uncreated energy of the universe. And so knowing that is what gives us the strength to accept and contain what comes up. When we go to the movies, we never think about the screen. The screen has no qualities. If it had qualities, if it had a color, we couldn't see red when it was projected on it. If it had a certain shape, the pictures would go on beyond it. We couldn't see it. So I'm squeezing the metaphor here to make it work, but it's the blankness of the screen that makes it useful. And because we know it's a projection in a movie, we can sit back and we can watch people blown up, we can watch buildings collapse, we can watch the silliest behavior, and we can watch it in safety because we know it's a projection. But we forget that our thoughts are projections of awareness on awareness. And we take them as solid and graspable as real, and they frighten us, or they attract us, or they make us run around. And so what David Brazier points out, again, containment is a noble truth. So why is it a noble truth? Well, the bars are full of people who are running away from what's arising. Porn sites are full of people who are running away from what's arising. Compulsive shoppers, illicit affairs, gamblers. These are all people running away from what's arising one way or another. And anyone who's been through 12-step or any kind of addiction treatment will tell you that all addictions are basically the same. Something arises which is too traumatic or too disturbing to actually think about consciously, and we begin automatic ritualized behavior. Spoon, cotton, and a syringe, grabbing the credit card, calling up the escort service, whatever it is. And the point is, it's really undignified. It's not the model of a life you would share with your children or in your kids' school or even to yourself in many cases. So once you can do this, once you build the trust that you can contain whatever arises, Buddha is inviting us to join a really big game. Of all the things available to do on earth, he's come up with a really big one, really compelling, really kind of grand, which is saving all beings, teaching all beings what the real undefined, undefiled root of the universe is. And then the fourth noble truth is called Marga. You know it. It's been translated into English. I'll read it again. The noble truth of Marga. Marga means track, like the track of an animal, the path. It's this: the noble eight-limb way, right view. Now, because of English, I don't like to use the word right. I prefer to substitute the word Buddhist, because other cultures, other people have their own way. But Buddha uses it in a specific way, not meaning right against wrong. He uses it to mean right as harmonizing with the essential view of emptiness, the essential view of the uncreated energy of the universe. So since I'm using his terms right now, I'll say right view or Buddhist view, right thought, Buddhist thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi, right meditation. Then he says, this is the noble truth of affliction. This was the insight, understanding, wisdom, knowledge, and clarity which arose in me about things I had not been taught. And that's kind of like why we revere the Buddha so much. He's like Einstein. He was the first guy that got relativity. Once Einstein got it, it could be explained and people could do whatever they wanted with it, and often did pretty bad things. Anyway, because that knowledge dawned in Buddha's world for the first time, we call it turning the Dharma wheel, turning the wheel of the Dharma. And, 3,000 years later, we're still making the effort and we're doing it. One of the reasons that I like The Feeling Buddha, I like this book and I like this way of approaching it, is because we're in a time of turmoil right now. There's so much that seems to be really on the line. There are people that are actively trying to turn the United States into an authoritarian, anti-democratic place. There are people who don't believe in science. There are people who do believe in science who are not being candid about some of the dangers of vaccines. I'm vaccinated. I believe in vaccines. But when I was researching this, I was really surprised to find out that the government itself has an agency that handles and pays people for difficulties with vaccines. They did that because they've indemnified all the manufacturers of vaccines because we need vaccines made. But they've paid out $3.6 billion in fees to people, in care for people who've had problems. So sometimes people who are afraid of vaccines are not being stupid, they're not being Trumpists. They read the same research by board-certified physicians that I did. The problem is that we can't discuss it without being, if I raise any doubt about vaccines, I'm an anti-vaxxer. That's the problem, not that people have doubts. So there's that turmoil. There's the turmoil of Afghanistan. There's the turmoil about cutting people away from the vote. There's the turmoil about rebuilding our infrastructure. There's the turmoil about global warming. All of these things, this is our world. And all of these things are produced by projection, attachment, over affection to one's own thinking, and not having a source, a dump to drop into where you can let it all float and come back and look at it again, fresh. We're all humans. We're all operating on a frequency that the bandwidth of humans, which means that any thought, any impulse, any sensation that can come up the spinal telephone of any human can come up in us. And we need to know it. We need to know that we can be envious, we can be jealous, we can be competitive, we can be judgmental. Everybody wants to be the Easter Bunny. But when we don't own the shadow side of the human spectrum, then we put it out on other people. Oh, it's the Taliban. Oh, those are the bad ones. If we could just get rid of those guys, we'd be fine. But we know it's not that simple. We know it was the good guys that bombed hotels in Baghdad in the middle of the night because we didn't like their leader, killing women and children in their beds. If you ask their relatives, who are the terrorists, they'd have a very different picture. So we need to be able to face all this completely openly and look at it from multiple points of view and listen to other people and contain what arises in us. The news is an affliction. And when anger arises because Joe Manchin won't vote for the $3.5 trillion or cinema or whatever it is, we have to come to terms with it. We have to realize that all these conditions came from previous conditions, and they came from previous conditions. And we've existed in a culture which has denigrated government since Ronald Reagan, who declared government the enemy. We've existed in a governmental system which is organized around procuring money. And money has been given the power of free speech by the Supreme Court. So people with the most money have the most speech. So you and I are left to compete with Fox News or MSNBC or CNN. Everybody's putting their spin. And the more complicated it gets, the more the world is going to require calm people who don't lose their heads and who can demonstrate that it's possible to face these stiff winds with compassion, with clarity, with calm. And when you see that, the first thing I saw was civil rights marchers in the 50s, dressed to go to church, being beset by howling mobs. That was their stiff winds. And they did that with such dignity and such fearlessness. I couldn't imagine myself doing it. But what arose for me was immediate admiration. And I knew I had to be on that side of the line. So we need to make choices as to where we're going to be. Buddhism and being attached to big mind does not mean everything's okay. But it does mean when you take a position against something, we have to take a position as if they are made of the same stuff in the universe that we are, as if they are an equal projection of emptiness. And when we stand against them, or when we try to protect other people, we have to do it in a way that's filled with respect, that's intractable, that's unmovable, even at the risk of our own life, but not angry, not judgmental, not demeaning, not screaming names. Because a protest is an invitation to a better world. And nobody accepts an invitation when they're being screamed at. So there's a practicality to David Brazier's understanding of Buddhism. It grounds it in the world that I know. I know many Buddhists who used to sit in front of the trains, bringing nuclear waste and stuff into Oakland. They registered their disapproval by sitting. It's not necessary to shout. If I had my way, I would suggest that every demonstration, people dressed as if they were going to church, they held signs, they were mute, and that we appointed proctors, gave them yellow highway jackets and whistles, and at the first sign of violence or disturbance or disruption, they blow the whistle and everybody who's really there for a protest sits down. Show the difference between who's there to pray and invite and who's there to make trouble. Because the real audience for all of these things is the vast population of the United States. It's the people between the Alleghenies and the Sierras. That's our audience for a protest. They're watching, they're trying to decide who's with us, who's behaving in a way that we can condone. And if you can show up and register your self-discipline by being silent and let your sign do the work and be well-dressed and be calm and relaxed, you'll win the trust of other people. But right now, protests are being cordoned off into a free speech area. Nobody's listening. The politicians are not listening. And the politicians are not the audience. The audience is the American people. The audience is the big picture, the big game. And that's the game Buddha's playing. Only Buddha's margins are beyond our national borders. Buddha's margin is all beings, and not just human beings, sentient beings. So I found myself really re-energized in my practice, in my study, by this book, and by merging what I know from 50 years of practice with this book. There's nothing contradictory. He's not asking us to forsake enlightenment, but he is reminding us that the Buddha said that the Eightfold Path itself is enlightenment. You may have a Kensho experience. You may wake up and have a big pop, but you can't live there. You can't stay there. In the world of form, that moment's gone. Taste it, enjoy it, but it's this world. And when we follow the Eightfold Path, what does it mean? It means we are consulting our internal Buddha, our wisdom, our innate sense. Is this right speech? Is this right livelihood? Is this right effort? There's no cops out there. This is an internal modification. We model the life of a Buddha with our own lives. That's what we're doing. He is not a God we worship. He is the unformed clarity of the universe, the essential emptiness of the universe. We have exactly his insight, exactly his understanding. And we model it, and he tells us how to model it. Model it by hewing as close as you can to the Eightfold Path. One of the great early Zen masters, Hakuin, who Rinzai, great Rinzai master, who used cartoons, songs, music, every kind of thing he could come up with to kind of get to people, get to common people. And he had many profound Kensho experiences in his life. But his final enlightenment, by his own admission, was his understanding that the Eightfold Path itself was enlightenment. So I guess I'm bringing this up to urge people not to seek some special state of mind. This consciousness is the consciousness of samsara and nirvana. They both exist. Enlightenment exists in this world of dark and light, in this world of samsara and nirvana. That's where you find it. And this ordinary mind, soft mind, mind of water, is the mind of the Buddha. And when we find our minds getting hard, sit down, meditate a little. I almost sounded like my grandmother. Sit, have something to eat. Anyway, I leave you with that. I'll show you this book again, The Feeling Buddha by David Brazer. David, by the way, is a psychotherapist. He lives in England, and he's a priest in an Amida Buddhist group, which is a very actively engaged group. They're engaged. They are engaged in the world. They are not just sitting on their cushions. And that's one of the reasons that I am attracted to secular practice. I'm in and of the world, and this is the backyard that I have to keep clean. So those of you who know, I invite you to join me in this little metta prayer. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Please take good care of yourselves and each other. I'll be back here in 2 weeks. I hope I see you again. Thank you so much.